Welcome. Tonight's story steps into the shadowed corners of 1856, where fear ran both ways and power was not as secure as it seemed. This is the chilling account of an enslaved man whose presence alone unnerved his masters, a man so feared that 15 overseers would ultimately take their own lives, an outcome whispered about, denied and buried for generations. As we unravel what really happened, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched, fact-checked true stories that take real time and effort to uncover, please hit subscribe and stay with us, because stories like this deserve to be told right. In 1856, the United States stood on the edge of collapse, its foundations cracked by a system that depended entirely on fear to survive. Slavery was not just an economic engine, it was a carefully maintained structure of control, enforced through violence, humiliation, and constant psychological pressure. Enslaved people were stripped of legal identity, treated as property rather than human beings, while laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act ensured that even escape offered no real safety. Fear flowed in one direction by design, from the enslaved to their masters, because without terror, the system could not function. Yet beneath this rigid order, another kind of fear quietly grew. Plantation owners and overseers lived with the knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered by the people they oppressed. Every whip cracked, every punishment delivered, deepened the possibility of retaliation. Nighttime patrols, armed overseers, and brutal discipline were not signs of strength, but of anxiety. The white authority class feared rebellion, poisoning, arson, and uprisings, haunted by memories of events like Nat Turner's revolt just decades earlier. By 1856, this tension had become unbearable. The country was divided. Violence had already erupted in places like Bleeding Kansas, and the question of slavery's future poisoned every aspect of American life. On plantations, overseers were expected to be ruthless, yet emotionally unbreakable, men who could dominate others without hesitation. But the constant exposure to cruelty, isolation, and paranoia took a heavy psychological toll. Fear, once a weapon, began to turn inward. It was within this unstable, fear-soaked world that stories began to surface. Stories of enslaved individuals who could not be controlled by terror alone. When an enslaved man no longer feared his overseer, the entire system trembled. In a society built on domination, the loss of psychological control was more dangerous than open rebellion. And in 1856, that fear would crystallize around one man whose very existence challenged the illusion of absolute power. No official record preserves his real name. In plantation ledgers, if he appeared at all, he was reduced to inventory, age, value, physical condition. But among overseers, whispers carried a different identity. He was known not for violence, but for something far more unsettling. He could not be broken. In a world where fear was meant to crush the spirit first and the body second, his calm presence became a threat. Those who encountered him described an enslaved man who spoke little, observed everything, and never begged. Punishments that left others shattered seemed to pass through him without the expected submission. He worked, endured, and watched. This unnerved overseers whose authority depended on visible dominance. A man who did not flinch, who met cruelty with silence instead of panic, disrupted the psychological order of the plantation. Over time, a reputation formed, half rumor, half warning. New overseers were told to be careful around him. Some claimed he could predict misfortune, others believed he carried a curse born from suffering. In reality, what they feared was simpler and more terrifying. He understood them. He saw their weakness, their dependence on intimidation, and their isolation. His awareness stripped them of the illusion that they were invincible. The enslaved community saw him differently. To them, he was a symbol of inner resistance, proof that the mind could remain free, even when the body was owned. He did not lead revolts or speak openly against his masters, but his refusal to submit emotionally became a quiet form of defiance. That silent strength, misunderstood and magnified by paranoia, fed the legends that grew around him. By the time his reputation spread beyond a single plantation, fear had already taken root among those meant to enforce order. Overseers came and went, but the stories followed him, stories of men who could not sleep, who drank heavily, who became obsessed with controlling him. In a system that demanded absolute dominance, the existence of one unafraid man was enough to unravel the minds of those who believed they held all the power. Overseers were trained to rule through intimidation. Their authority rested on a simple formula: fear equals control. But this man disrupted that balance in ways they could not explain. He did not challenge orders openly, did not threaten rebellion, and did not incite others with words. Instead, he unsettled overseers by denying them the one reaction they depended on most: visible fear. When punished, he endured. When shouted at, he listened. When threatened, he remained still. That composure made overseers question their own power. What frightened them further was the sense that he was always watching. Overseers reported feeling studied, as if their cruelty, habits, and weaknesses were being silently catalogued. In an environment where overseers already lived in isolation, often hated by both enslaved people and plantation owners, this feeling of being observed fed paranoia. They began to believe he knew when accidents would happen, when illnesses would strike, or when their authority would slip. Rational thought gave way to superstition. Rumors escalated the fear. Some overseers claimed punishments against him were followed by strange misfortunes, injuries, nightmares, sudden illness, or overwhelming dread. Whether coincidence or stress induced hallucination, these experiences were real to the men suffering them. In a brutal system with no room for emotional vulnerability, overseers could not admit fear without appearing weak. Instead, they internalized it, letting it grow unchecked. There was also a deeper, unspoken terror recognition. This man reflected back what overseers tried to suppress: their own moral collapse. His calm endurance forced them to confront the reality of their actions. Every lash, every threat, every humiliation seemed meaningless against someone who would not psychologically submit. That confrontation shattered the fragile justification overseers built to survive their roles. By the time fear fully took hold, it was no longer about the man himself. He had become a symbol of everything overseers could not control: guilt, doubt, and the possibility that their power was an illusion. In a system that demanded unquestioned dominance, that realization was enough to drive some men beyond the limits of their sanity. Plantation life in the mid-1800s was a cycle of exhaustion designed to break both body and spirit. Days began before sunrise and ended well after dark, with enslaved men and women forced into relentless labor, field work, hauling, construction, livestock care, often with little food and no rest. Every movement was monitored. Overseers carried whips, clubs, and firearms not just as tools of punishment, but as constant reminders that violence could be delivered at any moment, for any reason. Brutality was routine, not exceptional. Punishments were public to serve as warnings: lashings, shackling, isolation, and deprivation. Overseers were encouraged to be cruel because mercy was seen as weakness. Yet this cruelty came at a cost. Living daily as enforcers of violence hardened them outwardly while corroding them internally. Many overseers drank heavily, suffered insomnia, and lived in a permanent state of tension, knowing they were surrounded by people who despised them. The plantation was also a place of constant psychological warfare. Overseers used humiliation, threats of family separation, and unpredictable punishments to maintain control. But this unpredictability cut both ways. Overseers never knew when resentment might turn into resistance through sabotage, slowdowns, poisoning, or arson. Every broken tool or sick animal fed their fear that something was slipping beyond their control. Within this atmosphere, the unnamed enslaved man stood apart. While others were visibly crushed by the routine violence, he absorbed it without the expected signs of submission. His presence disrupted the plantation's rhythm. Overseers relied on terror to keep order, but terror loses power when it stops working. Each day he endured the same brutal environment without psychological collapse. He exposed a flaw in the system. The plantation, meant to be a machine of domination, instead became a pressure chamber. For the enslaved, it was suffering without escape. For the overseers, it was a place where cruelty had to be performed daily, even as it hollowed them out. And in that shared space of violence and fear, one man's unbroken composure began to haunt the very people tasked with enforcing the system. Slavery relied on more than iron shackles and whips. It depended on the belief that the enslaved were mentally conquered. Physical chains could restrain the body, but psychological domination was meant to crush hope, identity, and resistance. Overseers were taught that once a person believed they were powerless, obedience would follow naturally. Fear was the invisible chain that held everything together. This man shattered that illusion. Though physically enslaved, he retained something overseers could not reach: inner control. He understood that while his body could be punished, his mind was his own. He did not internalize the degradation forced upon him. This quiet mental resistance became a form of power far more dangerous than open defiance, because it could not be easily punished or displayed as a warning to others. Overseers sensed this imbalance immediately. They could beat him, overwork him, even threaten death, but none of it produced the psychological submission they expected. Instead, each failed attempt at breaking him reinforced his dominance in an unspoken way. The more they tried to assert control, the more powerless they felt. Authority that must constantly prove itself begins to rot from within. What made this dynamic terrifying was its silence. There were no speeches, no revolts, no dramatic confrontations, just endurance. That endurance forced overseers into constant self-doubt. If one man could resist mentally, how many others were only pretending to submit? This question alone was enough to destabilize a system built on absolute control. In the end, the chains remained on his body, but the fear settled into the minds of the overseers. The power dynamic had quietly reversed. He lived under bondage, yet they lived under dread of losing control, of being exposed, of realizing that their dominance was sustained not by strength, but by belief. And once belief cracks, even the strongest chains begin to fail. The first death shocked the plantation, but it was quietly explained away. An overseer, known for his harsh discipline and strict control, was found dead under circumstances that made little sense. Officially, it was labeled an accident, a sudden illness, or a personal weakness no one had noticed before. Plantation owners were quick to close the matter. Overseers were replaceable, questions were dangerous, but among those who worked the fields and those who enforced them, the story sounded different. In the days leading up to his death, the overseer had changed. He barely slept, drank more than usual, and was visibly agitated. Some said he complained of being watched. Others claimed he was obsessed with one enslaved man in particular, punishing him repeatedly, yet growing more unsettled. Each time the man refused to break, the suicide planted a seed of fear. Overseers were expected to be tough, emotionally unshakable men. Taking one's own life was seen as weakness, even disgrace. That made the death more disturbing than a murder would have been. If cruelty and authority were supposed to make overseers powerful, how had one of them collapsed so completely? Whispers spread that the overseer had lost control long before he lost his life. His authority over the plantation had slipped, not because of rebellion, but because of something internal, an erosion of certainty. Some believed guilt finally consumed him. Others believed fear drove him mad, and a few quietly connected his downfall to the enslaved man who never flinched under punishment. What mattered most was not how he died, but what followed. Overseers began watching each other closely. Night patrols grew more tense. Alcohol flowed more freely. And in the background of it all stood the same calm, silent figure, unchanged, unafraid. The first suicide marked a turning point. Not just a death, but the moment fear crossed the line and began to claim its enforcers. After the first suicide, plantation owners insisted it was an isolated incident, an unfortunate weakness in one man, nothing more. But when another overseer met the same end, and then another, denial became strategy. Masters understood the danger of patterns. A single death could be dismissed. A series could expose a truth they could not afford to acknowledge. So records were altered, causes of death softened, and conversations shut down. Behind closed doors, however, fear was spreading. Overseers began arriving already warned, told to keep control, to be firm, and most ominously, to watch that one. Each new overseer tried a different approach, harsher punishments, isolation, excessive surveillance. None of it worked. Instead, the same cycle repeated: sleeplessness, obsession, heavy drinking, withdrawal, then collapse. Plantation owners worked hard to separate the incidents, moving overseers between properties, blaming personal issues, or attributing deaths to illness and stress. But among the enslaved, the pattern was unmistakable. The same man remained. The same fear followed. And the same outcome eventually arrived. Silence became the master's strongest defense, because admitting a connection would mean admitting loss of control. The effort to hide the pattern only intensified it. Overseers, sensing that something was being concealed, grew more paranoid. They knew others before them had failed, yet were expected to succeed where the rest had broken. That pressure, combined with the haunting presence of a man they could not dominate, accelerated their mental decline. By the time several overseers were gone, the truth no longer needed to be spoken aloud. Fear had become institutional. The masters could suppress records, but they could not erase what everyone felt. This was no coincidence. It was a repeating fracture in a system that claimed absolute authority, one calm, unbroken man revealing, again and again, that the master's control was never as solid as they believed. As the deaths accumulated, the plantation became thick with rumors, quiet, cautious, and never spoken where overseers could hear. Enslaved workers shared warnings in glances and half-sentences, passing knowledge the only safe way they could. New overseers, they whispered, never lasted long. Some would arrive confident and cruel, only to unravel within months. Others came already nervous, having heard stories they pretended not to believe. Among the overseers themselves, rumors took a darker shape. They spoke of curses, of bad luck tied to certain punishments, of a man who seemed untouched by fear. A few asked to be transferred. Others tried to avoid direct contact with him altogether, assigning different tasks or delegating discipline to subordinates. Avoidance became its own confession. Authority was weakening. The unnamed enslaved man never encouraged these stories. He did not threaten, boast, or even acknowledge the fear surrounding him. His resistance was silent, disciplined, and internal. That silence gave rumors room to grow. Without clear cause or confrontation, the overseers' minds filled the gaps with their worst anxieties. What could not be explained became supernatural. What could not be controlled became terrifying. For the enslaved community, this silence was a strategy of survival. Open rebellion meant immediate death. But endurance, watching, remembering, and quietly resisting kept dignity alive. The man's composure sent a powerful, unspoken message. The system could hurt the body, but it could not own the mind. That idea spread faster than any spoken rebellion ever could. Warnings became ritual. New overseers were studied the way prey studies predators. The enslaved watched for signs, trembling hands, angry outbursts, sleepless eyes. They knew the pattern, even if the masters refused to name it. And as fear deepened on one side and quiet resolve strengthened on the other, the plantation moved closer to a breaking point that no rumor could contain. By the end of 1856, the plantation had lost an astonishing 15 overseers, men who were supposed to be the backbone of control and authority. Official records, however, told a very different story. Deaths were attributed to illness, accidental injury, or nervous breakdown. Careful phrases that masked the extraordinary pattern behind them. Plantation owners and local authorities were invested in keeping the truth invisible. Admitting fear had toppled 15 men would have undermined the credibility of the entire system. But the truth persisted in whispers and memory. Among the enslaved, the sequence of deaths was understood clearly. Each overseer came with confidence, attempted to dominate, and eventually collapsed, mentally or physically, under a pressure no one outside the plantation could comprehend. Stories of sleepless nights, obsessive drinking, and fatal despair circulated quietly, a stark contrast to the neutral, sanitized explanations in ledger books. The discrepancy between official records and lived reality highlights a critical point. History is often shaped by those in power, while the truth exists in the spaces they cannot fully control. The plantation owners' records erased panic, dread, and the subtle power of one unbroken man. But the people who experienced it never forgot. Their recollections preserved the real sequence, even if the courts, newspapers, and archives did not. This gap between recorded history and actual events demonstrates the systemic erasure of fear that enslaved people could wield. To outsiders, the deaths seemed coincidental or tragic, but within the plantation, a clear pattern had emerged. One man's unflinching presence, combined with the overseer's fragile minds, produced a deadly chain reaction that no official narrative could fully hide. Ultimately, the 15 lost overseers became a silent testament to the limits of domination. Physical power could enforce labor, but psychological resilience could quietly and fatally disrupt even the most brutal system. The story of this enslaved man and the 15 overseers who fell to despair did not survive in the official histories of the time. Plantation records, local newspapers, and even later historical accounts minimized or omitted the events entirely. To the writers of history, mostly white, mostly invested in maintaining the image of absolute control, the idea that an enslaved person could instill fear so profound that overseers would take their own lives was unacceptable. It threatened the narrative of unquestioned dominance that slavery relied upon. Even oral histories, passed down through the enslaved community, were often suppressed or forgotten. Families feared that speaking openly about these events could bring reprisal or tarnish their survival in a post-slavery world. Over generations, the story was reduced to rumor, myth, and fragments, never fully documented, never fully acknowledged. Scholars who later attempted to reconstruct it faced gaps in the archival record, inconsistencies in dates, and a deliberate absence of testimony from those who lived it. This erasure is significant because it illustrates how power controls not just the present, but memory itself. By labeling deaths as accidents or illnesses, those in authority erased evidence of their own vulnerability. The narrative became one where the enslaved were passive and the overseers unshakable, hiding the true psychological dynamics at play. In doing so, history denied the enslaved man his agency and transformed his quiet resistance into invisibility. Yet traces remained. Letters, plantation logs, and anecdotal accounts, however scattered, offered glimpses of the truth. Researchers who pieced together the events noted the patterns: a series of unexplained deaths, fear among new overseers, and a single figure whose endurance defied expectation. These fragments, once connected, reveal not only what happened, but also how the system of slavery feared and attempted to erase its own failures. Ultimately, history's attempt to erase him reflects the very reason his story matters. It exposes the fragility of oppressive power and highlights the ways in which the voices of the oppressed are often deliberately silenced, making the man's quiet defiance resonate even more profoundly. Centuries later, the story of this unnamed enslaved man and the 15 overseers who succumbed to despair is more than a historical curiosity. It is a stark lesson about the nature of power and fear. It shows that control is not absolute. Even in a system designed to dominate every aspect of life, physical force can restrain bodies, but it cannot command minds. When authority relies solely on intimidation, a single unbroken individual can destabilize an entire hierarchy. This case also exposes the psychological cost of cruelty on those who wield it. Overseers were supposed to be symbols of dominance, yet many were undone not by revolt or attack, but by their own fear and obsession. Their breakdowns illustrate how oppressive systems depend on the complicity and mental stability of those enforcing them. When that stability cracks, the system itself becomes vulnerable. Moreover, the story emphasizes the power of silent resistance. The man did not need to lead armed rebellion or openly confront his masters. His endurance and refusal to internalize fear were enough to shift the balance of power. His resistance was subtle yet devastating, a reminder that defiance takes many forms, and sometimes the most dangerous is the one that cannot be punished. Finally, the case underscores the selective nature of historical memory. The deliberate erasure of these events reflects how narratives are shaped by those in power, while the truth persists quietly among those who lived it. Remembering such stories restores agency to the oppressed and challenges assumptions about strength, authority, and courage. In the end, this forgotten episode teaches a timeless lesson: fear can be more powerful than force, resilience can outweigh brutality, and the human spirit, even when constrained, can disrupt the strongest of systems. It is a testament to the unrecorded courage that silently shaped history, leaving an enduring mark on those who came after.